started. And first I'll apologize for my kind of scratchy voice and nasally way of talking. I'm Dr. DiBartolomeo, and I'm the Director of Slavic and East European Studies as well as Russian Studies here at WVU. And this is the final event for our semester, our year-long commemoration of the Russian Revolution of 1917. So what we've been doing throughout the semester, as well as a few lectures in the spring semester, is trying to note not only the Russian Revolution in a very narrow historical sense, or only in the year 1917 through 1922, but look more broadly at the revolutionary world and ways of doing revolution in art, in music, in various other disciplines. So tonight is our final one for the year, and we're very appreciative that you guys dragged yourselves here on a Monday night, right before finals. So kudos to you. I'll make sure you all get extra credit in your classes, in geology or geography even too. So tonight we're really lucky to have actually my dissertation director, Professor Beth Holmgren from Duke now. She left UNC Chapel Hill and went
under great protest.
and went to the Eagle people down the road.
I'm sorry.
At Duke. And her publications are really too numerous to list, but she is both a Russianist and an East Europeanist, and in particular a Polanist, or as Paul Debreceni used to say, a Polanist. He's Hungarian and he had a very funny accent. So we will be looking tonight at sexual revolution in a broader sense, because Dr. Holmgren treats women's rights, women's issues, women's literature, as well as culture, history, literature, film. She also teaches language. She does it all, and she does it all incredibly well. So thank you again for attending. And if you have questions about the Slavic and East European Studies program, further events, we also have a lovely website that Garrett made. Please do come and talk to me afterwards, and otherwise, enjoy the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Buenos aplausos. Lisa was a wonderful advisee, Professor Dr. Bartolomeo, I should say, Professor Bartolomeo. And if you're not a major or a minor or something, you should really think about talking to Dr. Bartolomeo, because it would mean that you would get extra credit in everything you do at WVU. Everything.
Yes.
You would basically earn the major in maybe a semester or so?
Sure.
Yeah, we all, I mean, I do the same thing. I promise my students everything. And I was going to talk about both the Soviet Union and Poland, but I realized why not just do the Soviet Union, because that's what right now interests me. And I also have to say that this particular talk was inspired by Lisa and her interest in fashion and her ability to wear anything, but also the notion of people having a good time expressing themselves through fashion, and a fashion that was really, I say, revolutionary, but not according to the Bolsheviks. So what the title of this is Comrades versus Flappers: How the Bolshevik Revolution Rolled Over Women's Lives, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. And I'm not going to stand up here and be a feminist, chiding the Bolsheviks. I'm going to be saying, look, you screwed things up, and women wanted to have fun, and they couldn't have fun with you. And that's one of the reasons why the Soviet Union fell apart. That's just one of the many reasons. So, as I said, the revised title is much more dire. I had something about flappers and something in 1920s Soviet Union and Poland, and now I'm focusing on the Soviet Union. And in consequence, I'd like to start us out today, since I'm talking about the revolution rolling over women, with a quote from a novel titled Cement, which is the best paving material that I know. This actually, before I move on, because this is such a beautiful picture, does anybody have any idea who this might be? This is not a Russian. This is an American. Anybody have a guess?
Zelda Fitzgerald.
I'm sorry?
Zelda Fitzgerald.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like Zelda. She looks a lot like Zelda. She certainly is wearing the kind of flapper outfit that Zelda would wear. This is Clara Bow, and she was the major star of certainly The Silence that starred Flappers, And just one thing I wanted to tell you is that she was called the It Girl. I mean, what do you think it meant? That's not a trick question. It?
Sex.
She has it.
What's that?
Sex.
Sex, yes, sex. I mean, sex appeal. They tried to refine it and say sex appeal, charisma, all rolled up in one. But she was a ball of fire. She could dance. She could do the Charleston and all of that. So I'd like to start out with her and then go on here to, let me do this right, to cement. So this is, these are pictures of happy comrades, or variously, not quite as excited as others. But this is the novel Cement, which was written in 1925. And then subsequently rewritten a number of times by Fyodor Gladkov. And this 1925 version came out after the Bolsheviks had won the Civil War. So the Red Army had won the Civil War, the Soviet Union was established, and by 1925, the new Soviet government, which was desperate to revive an economy shattered by war, revolution, and an over-requisitioning of goods, of crops, and of livestock, had introduced what was called the New Economic Policy, or NEP. I know it sounds like something you might put on your legs to shave them, but it was actually called NEP, and that's what we'll call it. And it lasted from 1921 to 1928. NEP eased up on the Soviet government's authoritarian control of certain sectors of society, effected a partial truce in the class war between the working class, which was seen to be the leading class, an alienated peasantry because they've been stripped of all of their livestock and crops, and a new technocrat intelligentsia because the Bolsheviks needed these people who were technically skilled to help them build up their industries again. NEP also permitted some private enterprise in retail, entertainment, and the restaurant business, and it also allowed for very limited social experimentation. Though the party decided to do this, and Lenin started this, Vladimir Lenin, who was the leader at this time of the Soviet Union, many party faithful were dismayed by NEP because they saw it as evidence of serious ideological and behavioral backsliding. And the protagonists in Gladkov's Cement were probably the most dismayed. In the passage I'm about to read, an ardent young Bolshevik woman named Polya Mechova, this is the golden curled Polya, and she is sort of the weak link in all of this group. This golden haired girl is deeply troubled by the first signs of NEP as it appears in new kinds of clothing that people are wearing, and also the sign of cafes and the sounds of cafes and the sound of people having a good time. All right, so, and I quote, this is not going to be deathless prose, so just bear with me for a little bit. In the morning, when Polya went to the women's section, or when she returned home after 4 o'clock, she ran along the streets as though blown by the wind. People walked by her side, met her, followed her, passed her, reflected in her eyes as faded shadows. She could not raise her head to look calmly and steadily at the shop windows, or through the open doors, or at the people who appeared so different from what they used to be. She did not look, yet somehow knew that the women were not the same as they had been before, in the spring. Their clothes were smarter. They were wearing flower-trimmed hats, transparent muslin, and fashionable French heels. The men also had changed. They were wearing cuffs and ties and patent leather boots. Again, there was a smell of perfume, as if perfume had not been there. Voices sounded loud and joyful like those of the birds. Through the open doors in the cafes, one saw phantoms crowded in and out of the blue tobacco smoke. Amidst the dull uproar of conversation, china was rattling. The dice was clattering in some game of chance. And from the depths of the tobacco-filled den issued the tones of stringed instruments. Where did all this come from? And why did it come so quickly, so impudently and abundantly? And why did this all pass over her, Polya Mechova, oppressing her and filling her mind with trouble and melancholy? You could say maybe Polya was deranged, but if Polya could shake off her melancholy and mount some kind of resistance, she could easily be the protesting figure in this Soviet poster. The woman wearing sensible, if rather bright, work clothes, and the red kerchief that designated that she was a true comrade. She was a true member of the Bolshevik Party, that she was a woman worker, a rabotnitsa. of the working class. Her raised hand, and also the imperative of the verb. How many of you know Russian in this group? Anybody? Okay, I'll just tell you it's stoy. It's the imperative for stand or halt, stop. So she's basically saying, stop. These are all directed against the figure of the flapper, this rather phantom-like person in the white dress with no design on it, because I think that they didn't want anyone to copy the design from the poster and make their own dress. She's identified by her dress and her hat, if not by her rather saccharine pose, because flappers never looked sweet. They always looked tough or outrageous. The flapper was the female icon of the Roaring Twenties in North America and Europe. She represented a new model of liberated dress, assertive behavior, and a rule-breaking, and some would say self-indulgent lifestyle. In this Soviet poster, the flapper dress is typical because it drops, as someone, this is a costume historian said, it drops in a kind of boxy shape. It drops straight from the shoulders to a little below the hips, or really just below the waist. And then it has a short skirt. And it also clings to the woman's small-breasted, slender body, her almost androgynous figure. The flapper is identified with these smaller allegorical figures. I don't know if you can make them out, but I'll tell you, they're all a bunch of capitalist lowlifes. They're all, they're like an allegory for all of the Soviet evils that Bolsheviks were complaining about. Drinking too much, loose living, a preoccupation with how you dressed, and how much money you made. For the disapproving Rabotnitsa, as for the troubled Polya, let's not forget Polya, the appearance of this smartly dressed woman and her unruly coterie warned of the vampiric, can I say that way? Is that all right? Rebirth of a consuming, parasitic bourgeoisie, a middle class. What I'd like to do today with you all is to reverse the position of this Rabotnitsa, this woman worker, and the flapper, and may also make the flapper look a little better, and sort of two size. And I'd then like to replace all of these lowlifes with a kind of line of Soviet women workers. And what I would want, as they were facing you, I'd like you to see that their faces were all alight with either interest or absolute rapture at looking at this wonderful gown that the flapper is wearing. Because that was much more the case than the woman worker saying, no, I want none of this. I argue that most of the Bolshevik authorities in power in the first decades of the USSR, from top bureaucrats to organizers of women and youth, puritanically criticized and eventually banished the flapper, a response which, I contend, by extension, describes a recurring pattern of suppressing Soviet women's desire, power, and agency for long decades to come. A newly forming group of Soviet or Bolshevik gatekeepers just didn't want Soviet girls to have fun. In fact, the gatekeepers behaved far more like the bourgeoisie they disdained than did the Soviet youth that they deemed to be politically misguided and on the precipice of damnation, or at least certainly communist damnation. From the very outset, I think we need to recognize that any didactic or propagandistic poster, a representation of the Soviet working class's views, exactly what I've just given you, the quote from Cement and this poster, were most likely prescriptive or coercive. They weren't really reflecting what was going on with the working class. That was not what they were about. They were not to be critical realists. They were to be, not yet, but they would become socialist realists, which would mean that they would need to show the working people as they were developing towards their utopia. And they certainly would not show clashing desires in the working class. The gap between these Soviet gatekeepers who told people how they should behave and actual Soviet workers yawned very wide in the case of the Soviet flapper, as historian Anne Gorsuch has pointed out in her terrific book, which I highly recommend, Youth in Revolutionary Russia, Enthusiasts, Bohemians, and then the last noun in this case is delinquents, which she picked up right from the Soviet press. Gorsuch observes that Soviet working class youth became fascinated with the clothes and looks they saw in fashion magazines and especially imported Hollywood films. And you have to realize Hollywood is sending films to the Soviet Union all through the 20s. People are watching these films and getting ideas of how they should behave, from things ranging from Clara Bow, the it girl, to Mary Pickford, who was, America's sweetheart. And I would dare say that Hollywood was the greatest purveyor of mass desire between the two world wars. Lots of young Soviet female workers wanted to dress and play in their leisure hours as flappers. Gorsuch writes, young women used Russian fashion magazines. So let me give you an example. This is a Russian fashion magazine that came out during the NEP period, though you will probably note that the sleeves are very long, the skirt is a little more modest, and there is not a low neckline. There's not a lot of exposure in these particular patterns. But these young women used Russian fashion magazines to reproduce the styles of New York and Paris at home with whatever hard-won materials they could find in public markets or Soviet stores. While the leaders of the Komsomol, that is the major communist Soviet youth group, and the Zhenotdel, and I'm sorry if you don't know Russian, Zhenotdel means the women's section, and that was something that was established by the Communist Party at the beginning of the Soviet Union to help integrate women into the new Soviet state. And that was mainly staffed by women, and the women organizers were very prominent there. These two groups, the Komsomol and the Zhenotdel, could not yet ban flappers during NEP, but they complained vociferously in print that young women consumed with dressing and making up like flappers were betraying their inherently good working class pedigree, learning to become individualistic, shallow, and even, dare they say, self-centered, rather than working for the collective common good. In the Bolshevik worldview, and this is a point I want to make over and over again, that the identity marker of class was what spelled your value. If you were of the working class, you were golden. If you were of the aristocratic class, you were going to go to some sort of camp. Or you'd certainly be dispossessed and maybe sent to a camp or maybe exiled in some other way. On the other hand, the markers of gender and sexuality, and nobody even thought about sexuality at this point, but the markers of gender and sexuality for women were always perceived to be inferior and completely almost non-markers for women as opposed to men. In fact, Bolshevik educators worried that they needed to completely re-educate female workers because women were most prone to slide into the bourgeois cesspool. That they would be only worried about having children and the family. That would be biologically that's what they were intended for, and also that any kind of sexual advancement for women would be deplorable. I mean, it would just not be right because women should not be. I mean, this is all following from Victorian notions of what women should not do. We also need to remember, and this is a very important point, that the Bolshevik organizers were all descended from revolutionaries who had been underground in Tsarist Russia since the 1860s. People who had gone up against the Tsars. I'm not trying to snub you, Garrett. I know you're the Tsar of the Russian Club, and we don't hold you responsible for any of this. But those who opposed the Tsar and the system that obviously was so onerous to 90% of the population, these people and their successors from the 1860s up to 1917, and particularly these women, had schooled themselves for decades to achieve a partial equality with the men in their group, basically by completely conforming with the models of the men in their group. They tried their best to become men, or to become as like men as they possibly could. So these educated women who joined the party, and they were not working class, they were usually from what was a de facto middle class, sort of middle and lower gentry, they eschewed anything fashionable, and they wore plain, modest clothing. They wore dark dresses, and they only maybe used a white collar for adornment. They were very puritanical in that regard. Oh, this is another fashion. Actually, this is very interesting. This is it's our models, and this is flapper wear from Central Asia. It's interesting. So it has patterns from the different Asian republics of the Soviet Union. All right, here is an example.